live from beautiful downtown Columbia, Pennsylvania. Hi, everybody. We're glad you're here. This is our Wednesday morning book club, and we are looking at Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And we watched the film Agent of Grace, I think was the title on it. There's 2 or 3 films about Bonhoeffer, and all of them are pretty adequate for getting the basic storyline. And we thought we would look at first 3 chapters of Discipleship, and then do the same with Life Together, get a sampling. I was looking at the different translations and so forth that are out, and when Cost of Discipleship first came out in, was it 36 or 37, obviously in German, and there's been several attempts at translation and different editions of this. The Augsburg Fortress Publishing House has a critical edition, and there's, I think, 16 volumes of Bonhoeffer's work with them. And in the introduction in this volume, they were talking about the translation process and how difficult it is to take concepts and bring them out of one language into another one, even something that's been pretty common like German to English. I was going to say it's not like Germany's a foreign country, but Western European, Germany's actually more central. But there are words, for example, during the National Socialist period, whenever you had the word folk, like the people, it could have multiple meanings. And so if you have Volkskirche, it's like the people's church or the church of the people. But during the National Socialist period, they were the German Workers' Party, and Hitler talked often about the folk. And the Nazi understanding, of course, was always brought up under their political philosophy, where they wanted to bring everything in the country into a common pattern with a strong central executive and ultimately one leader. So you see something like Volkskirche, how do you translate that? So you have to get into the context of it. And for this translation, they had 2 individuals in particular, one of them a German that spent a good part of their adult life working in the United States. So you had the German language and the American English. And then the other one was a woman who was an American who worked for the World Council of Churches in the old German Democratic Republic. So you had the American going German, and still they had to do things like find the students at the preacher seminary and talk with them and to find out how did Bonhoeffer use this. And of course they're looking back to the 1930s, and some of them had notes and so forth. But it was interesting how complicated it is to get that. And I'm a little bit more, I have my ears up on that, because I have a couple that are good friends. Holger married my organist, Dawn Sontag. She was studying music at the University of Heidelberg, and he was getting a doctorate in systematic theology there, and started coming to our worship service. And they are really annoyed at Eric Metaxas' book on Bonhoeffer. And one of the things that Dawn said that she did not like about the book was, quote, he didn't even bother to read any of it in the original languages. To which I said, I can't speak for Metaxas, but I can tell you that I have dabbled in trying to learn German pretty much my entire life, and of the opinion that if you don't get taught it at the breast by your mother, you don't know the language. And I said, that's why people like you and Holger exist, to translate it properly for us that can't get the language. So we'll see what happens. So, but anyway, many translations, even the title, for example, the cost of discipleship was how it was brought forward into English, and that's not Bonhoeffer's title. His was just straight discipleship. And of course, the whole business of cheap versus costly grace probably fed the title. And when you turn a manuscript over to a publisher, you lose control of it. Some publisher probably thought, this will sell better than that, and hence the title. But they did things in some of the earlier translations. Bonhoeffer divided the book into 2 parts, and the first English ones came out in 4 parts, which doesn't seem like a lot, but it just strikes me that if you're wanting to, like, if you think this German book ought to be read by an English audience, you ought to let the German author come forward. And they didn't. And so this critical edition is interesting, where you have a real effort being made by people to kind of, let's get back to Bonhoeffer as best we possibly can and let him speak. The 2 translators were Barbara Green and Reinhard Krauss, and the editors for this edition are Jeff Kelly and John Godsey. And I met Kelly one time, and his classic kind of scholarly guy. He's a good man. It was a fun afternoon. He was very knowledgeable. So today we have kind of worked our way through the first chapter on costly grace, and that's the one that is most familiar to people, the distinction that Bonhoeffer made, and it was a pretty blistering attack on the condition of the Lutheran Church in Germany at the time, and it's different than the American church to be in Germany. They had at the way the German Republic came into existence was the old Holy Roman Empire eventually came up underneath the German Empire that was, its hub was east of Berlin, the Hohenzollern dynasty, and Germany didn't really become a nation state like we think of it today until the 1860s under Bismarck, which it pulled together over 300 different principalities and kingdoms and imperial free cities, and then there are regions in Europe where the people speak German, and they kind of pulled them all in as a cultural entity. So it evolved very differently to become a nation state. Each one of those principalities and so forth had their own standalone church, and it was always an issue after the 30 Years' War that the Protestants were broken up into so many small churches, and there had been an attempt to rival the Catholics, which of course have their own system that they superimpose on the world with popes and cardinals and bishops, and it goes downhill. So that in Germany there was always this sort of large national church envy. And one of the things that the Nazis did that was popular within the church was they created, for the first time, really a national Protestant church. And that was something that had been in the works for years and years and years, and it came to fruition under the Nazis. And so you had this thing that people wanted, and they got it, and then it was kind of hard to turn right around and then blast the people that gave you what you wanted. And I mentioned last week the pastors I talked to that said it was hard to see early on when the Nazis were pushing positive Christianity. And if you're, like when you register for school, name, address, phone number, next of kin, confession, and you had two choices. You could be Evangelisch or Katholisch, period. You were one or the other. The IRS collects your church dues, and nobody goes. They still don't. It's like a 3% attendance rate. Yet you have over 90% baptized, confirmed, married, buried. So these church issues were hard to see past. And Bonhoeffer was part of a group that called themselves the Confessing Church. And their complaint here in Cost of Discipleship is these, there were, I think, 28 Landkirche, which were the smaller regional churches right before the war started, and then they're sort of like subdivisions of the national church now. But it was, the more in bed you are with the general culture around you, the less prophetic the church is. And when every single human being you know is baptized and is either a Catholic or a Protestant, you have this lowering of any kind of standards to the point where the church had become synonymous with the culture. And you saw this in Scandinavia as well. It used to be that your baptismal certificate and your birth certificate in Sweden were one and the same. Yep. And there were jokes like, can you name the greatest Swedish tennis player that ever, or Lutheran Swedish tennis player that ever lived? And it's like Swedish and Lutheran, there was no distinction between the words. It was the same.
And like waters it down.
Yeah, so when Bonhoeffer writes about cheap grace and being totally in bed with the culture around you, where what ends up happening is you take the doctrine of justification by grace and you make that a leading principle of your sort of pseudo-religious philosophy. But what ends up happening is there's no behavior that goes with it that's distinctly Christian. And so that's a part of this cheap grace piece. And it sets up the middle part that we alluded to last week, but didn't really get into, about Bonhoeffer looked very closely at Luther, which is a very German Lutheran thing to do. And Luther's very, his distinctions sometimes are pretty fine. And when he talked about being saved by grace, he's assuming that entire experience of Anfechtung was the word he used, the wrestling with the demons of nothingness, and the fasting and the confessions and the flagellations and all those things that were part of a medieval quest to find peace with God. And at the end of it, realizing that God is there loving you in spite of yourself, in spite of your best efforts. But without that struggle, if you just start at grace, there's something fundamentally missing. And it's kind of like materialism on one level. I had an uncle who was a retired Navy captain, and in all his career he kind of dreamed of owning his own sailboat when he retired. And my aunt was foursquare in on the dream, and they saved for it, and they paid cash for it, and they happily did all the sailor stuff that you do on the boat. And in the slip next to theirs, there was a young lawyer that saw a movie or something and thought it would be cool and bought the boat. And it was kind of a pain in the butt to him and his wife that they had to come down there and, you know, scrape the barnacles off the bottom of the boat. And it's a lot of work to have a sailboat. And Uncle Al and Aunt Claire were happy with it because it was a dream of decades for them. And this other couple ended up selling the boat and, you know, moving on to something else. It wasn't any fun for them because there had never been any kind of a struggle. I mean, the guy obviously worked hard to go through law school, and he was with a firm that paid him well, and definitely earning his money, but he didn't earn the dream. And so without that appreciation that comes from that, you're missing something. So he talks a lot about Luther fleeing the world into what he had been told, like, if you really want to be right with God, your problem is you're married, you need to go over and become a monk and fast 2-3 days a week and pray 7 hours a day and go to mass every day and, you know, novenas and pilgrimages, and, you know, then you'll do enough for God to like you, and that's your religious experience. That's what they were being told. So in Luther's story, he's started law school, he's brilliant, swept through, in the European system, it's not a time-based, it's an exam-based movement forward, and people like Luther knock off a 4-year bachelor's degree in about 6 months to a year. Master's degree is supposed to be 2 years. On top of that, he's done in 6 months. Got his doctorate in a year. Just, and everybody else is, and then you read the normal people, and it's like, so-and-so was a student at Wittenberg for 6 years before he got his master's degree.
Yeah.
And, there's a normal person. So Luther's in law school, and plague hit, and there were, they lived in these sort of student residences, and there were a couple of upperclassmen in law school that Luther was friends with that died of the plague. And he was actually nursing one of them, and the guy's last words were, "I am so sorry that I went to law school. I should have become a monk and attended to my soul." And then he died. And, so that's going on around Luther. I think he was drunk and playing mumbly peg, but he stabbed himself in the leg and hit an artery, and they couldn't get it to stop. And so his friends tied a tourniquet on him and ran into town and got a doctor and a cart, and they came out, and the doctor managed to get the blood stopped, put him in the cart, took him into town, they had him in a bed somewhere, and then the wound opened up again, and the doctor came back and barely kept him from bleeding to death. So all of this is happening, and then he gets called home from the university to talk to his dad and mom about something, and then on his way back, with all this death and destruction going on around him and his near-death experience and so forth, he almost gets hit by a bolt of lightning, and he says, "Saint Anne, save me and I'll be a monk." And that's what you did. I mean, it's like death was everywhere, and the biggest fear was to die suddenly, as in, I didn't get to confess. Because confession only covered, absolution only covered confessed sin. So if you died unconfessed, then you're going to the judgment with this list of sins, and the best you could hope for was a long time in purgatory. And monks, it's like a get out of jail free card, because they were living this life totally dedicated and so forth. And so Luther went seeking that, and I think he's a lot like St. Paul in that I think Paul exhausted Judaism, and then he ran into Jesus. And he, for Saul, he could literally say in one of his epistles, as to keeping the law, I did it perfectly. Moves on. And this is the guy that said, all of sin and fall short of the glory of God. There's none righteous, no, not even one. And in the previous letter, he's saying, yeah, that business of keeping, kosher, orthodox, all of it, I did that without flaw. So I think he did all of that. He went to Jerusalem. He studied under Gamaliel, who was the grandson of the great Rabbi Hillel. And I don't think there was anything in Judaism that Saul of Tarsus didn't just suck up and master. And then he's in charge of the execution detail of Stephen and sees his confession. And then shortly after that, he runs into Jesus on the road to Damascus. Luther's kind of the same way. He went into the monastery and threw himself into it. And, some people say, well, he probably couldn't handle being celibate or whatever. And Luther addressed that. He said, it wasn't a problem. It just didn't bother me at all.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't like he was, pining away to be married and have, family life and stuff. He blew through it all and was still seeking, probably even more than before. And then he comes out of the monastery, and that's Bonhoeffer's point, is that Luther going into the monastery didn't do anything but blows the doors off the world when he comes out, because now he's talking about y'all had domesticated Jesus, and you can't contain him. And so Luther presents this whole struggle, this realization of who Jesus is coming, and it was always von außen, from the outside, that this gospel, this good news of God in Christ, in the grace that's there, and suddenly Jesus is no longer domesticated. So that's what he's trying to get at in the first chapter about the call. And then, of course, it ends with, blessed are they who already stand at the end of the path on which we wish to embark, and perceive with amazement what really seems inconceivable, that grace is costly precisely because it is pure grace, because it is God's grace in Jesus Christ. Blessed are they who, by simply following Jesus, are overcome by his grace, so that with humble spirit they may praise the grace of Christ, which alone is effective. Blessed are they who, in the knowledge of such grace, can live in the world without losing themselves in it. In following Christ, their heavenly home has become so certain that they are truly free for life in this world. Blessed are they for whom following Jesus Christ means nothing other than living from grace, and for whom grace means following Christ. Blessed are they who, in this sense, have become Christian, for whom the word of grace has been merciful. So, it's undeserved favor by God in Christ, in the power of the Holy Spirit in your life. And you really are acceptable to God. You don't have to win him over. So, any thoughts that you had from last week before we press on here? Because he's going to take some of these things like when Christ calls a man or calls a person, he calls that person to come and die to themselves.
Yeah, that it's funny you say that because I have that underlined. Instead of calling us to follow Christ, it has hardened us in our disobedience.
Ah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. There's who was it? I think it was Irma Bombeck that had a joke about two friends that got together for coffee and hadn't seen each other. It was at school, and one of them's got this diamond ring, and her girlfriend says, "Ooh, tell me about the diamond." She goes, "Well, like all great stones, it has a curse with it." And she goes, "Tell me." She goes, "This is the Gladfelter diamond, and the curse is Stanley Gladfelter."
Oh my gosh!
So, the good news and the bad news is God's undeserved favor, more than you could imagine, and it's all in Jesus. And it's it's Jesus or nothing. So, and he is a multi-faceted personality. And one of the things that you really kind of have to get your head around is Lord, which means absolute dictator. Now, he may be really nice about it, or not, but at the end of the conversation, he's the guy walking around with the coffee mug that says, "Me boss, you not." So now we get to chapter 2, the call to discipleship.
Mm-hmm.
So, Ted, you alluded to this when we were getting started here this morning. As Jesus is walking along, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. Period. No context, no explanation, no anything other than close the books, walk away, and follow Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
What's Mark trying to make sure we get? It's chapter 2, so this is right at the very beginning. I don't know about you, but I find that to be kind of stark.
Oh yeah.
In fact, I remember in Gelnhausen, it's probably 1967, there was a young chaplain, this came up in the lectionary, and he tried to deal with it, and he was really struggling with it, and then we had Sunday school class with him afterwards, we talked about it some more, and he was like, I'm sorry I got this text today, because I don't understand it, and I get that. There's nothing there. There's no connecting with Alphaeus. Here he is, dead-end job as a tax farmer in backwater. It's like none of that's there. There's no psychology about midlife crisis or, my wife's dead, and, there's
Mm-hmm.
nothing.
Mm-mm.
There's no context whatsoever other than the word of Jesus that says, "Follow me."
The only thing that down here at the bottom, then I've read that 4 or 5 times, and it says, the encounter is a testimony to the absolute direct and accountability authority of Jesus. There is no need of any preliminaries and no other consequence but obedience to the call. And if you hold that into that he is Lord, it wasn't a suggestion. It was let's go. And I've never had one of those type, as I've said earlier, I've never had one of those situations. It was bad enough to follow sometimes in the military, to stand there and have somebody higher up say, okay, fellas, we're going, I don't know about that. I really might not want to do that today, but the unbelievable, the key is the obedience, because the faith, and I keep hearing this, it's repeated over and over and over in this chapter.
Yeah, that's what the chapter's about.
Obedience. And it's human nature, and I'm definitely guilty of this. I may go along sometimes, and then all of a sudden it's like, I'll be digging my heels in and I'll meet you so far, but that's about it. And it's that thing of the mind, if it would, I think that's where that human thing is. It just will not let you go, and you don't, I hate to say it, maybe you just don't trust, or it goes contrary to everything.
Faith and trust are literally synonymous.
It's just contrary to what you, especially today. We're not talking 2,000 years ago, where guys didn't have much choice to eat or fish, sit around, play with rocks all day, or what have you, or sit there in the sun. Life, this, that, and things to, everything around you. And I'm not saying it can't be done, but it has become a lot more difficult. I really believe that.
Well, and we're older. Have you ever seen a leader prove not to be trustworthy?
Well, like little, even the children, just quick example, the kids that go to kindergarten, for that person right there in front of them teaching, they believe them, they trust them, they follow them. In most cases, easily guided and led and stuff, but as you become more world weary or whatever else, then you can lose that kind of thing. But the key there, and this is, and it was repeated over, because I didn't actually go through the whole chapter and underline everything yet, but it's repeated quite a few times in there. Obedience is the first part. If you're not going to become obedient to the word, then it's a stumbling block at that point.
Yeah.
That's really what it comes down to.
What were you going to say?
I forget. It was. Wow. He was
Untrustworthy
talking.
leaders.
Well, it's like we don't want to be told what to do. That's the human nature.
Yeah.
We don't, and even, and Ted said he feels it's getting worse. I'm not totally on board with that thought, because I'm like, it's all the time. It's like social media and ABC and NBC, might be making us feel like it's getting worse, but I think it's just the way it's being communicated. I think it's underlying. It's here all the time, and.
Well, we're so used to in our society spin, which is propaganda, and
right.
I had an occasion to visit in 1 week government working with media, and then moving up to New York with the media, and we were at USA Today, and they have an editorial meeting very early in the morning every day, and there's a small group of half a dozen people that are deciding what's going in their national paper. And that, at the time, newspapers were still a big deal, and you're looking around the room, and do you remember the name Fred Barnes? He interviewed Reagan, I think it was, and he asked him about his religious something or other, and that kind of made a big splash. And I was in a small group with Barnes, and I said, I don't mean to be disrespectful. He took it badly anyway. But who do you think you are to have this kind of power? And, it's like you went to one of 3,500 universities and you happen to have this job, but it's not like you came up in the military and then you served in the Peace Corps. It's not like your resume sets you up as somebody with this vast experience and you're really kind of positioned, and you know, he didn't like my question, but it's you get jaded by the propaganda.
Right, and like Ted said, the word obedience, like, I think the word obedience it's like rubbing sandpaper on people.
Well, like
Some,
doing weddings,
can.
every bride is like, I'm not saying obey.
Right, right.
And,
It
you
has
know,
a negative undertone to it.
It's
yeah.
been 500 years since that was in the prayer book. This, but anyway, he's going to pick up on this faith, which is trust and obedience.
Mhm.
And I think what he's saying here is the typical thing is to say, okay, you trust and then you learn to obey, and that's kind of normal. Like, we like the sequencing of that. It leaves us feeling more in control. And what Bonhoeffer's saying is it's not sequential. It's he's famous for these paradoxical statements, and this one I want to make sure I get it right, where he links faith and obedience as two sentences that both are true.
Oh, yeah.
I read this on my Kindle, and then I pulled out a hard copy. Wherever that is, but instead of it being one or the other leading, and obviously the next one following, it's almost like they're simultaneous, and you don't have one without the other. And if you say you have faith, it's going to show itself as obedience instantaneously with no time lag, and only the obedient can be faithful. You know, it's kind of a mix there. So with our story here of Levi, aka Matthew, son of Alphaeus, he gets up and he walks away. And later in the chapter, he'll talk about some things with other people coming to Jesus and saying, I want to be a disciple, but, and if there's a but, there's no faith. So,
yeah, the simple line, discipleship means adherence to Christ.
yep. And, you know, Jesus is the one who's calling. Jesus is the entire context. And when you get around the church today, you know, this is a good example. This is a very typical group of Lutherans in this church. You know, being an interim, I've been in like 8 or 9, and Landisville was either 9 or 10, and then all the military ones. Very typical. Nothing unusual here at all. And there are people here that are, the statistics from the Barna Group indicate that 1/3 of the people that attend worship are agnostic, that they don't have faith, they don't know.
Yeah.
And some are even atheists. One of my religion professors, who was Episcopalian and was on whatever they call their national parish council, and he's like, I'm an agnostic, and PhD in philosophy and religion, and he goes, I don't know, I can't put it to bed, I'm just not sure.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a real issue.
Well, yeah, just think of all that we were just saying about Germany, and everybody got baptized, and you know, there's probably a lot of agnostics there because they don't know, you know.
Yeah. So he goes on from, you know, putting Jesus right in front of you. And a friend of mine used to do this kind of typical Palestinian male in the first century. He was about 5'8", 5'9", weighed about 180 pounds, olive skin, dark brown hair, dark brown eyes, pretty good teeth because they didn't have sugar, tended to be on the lean side because there was famine every 7 years or so, worked with their hands, walked everywhere. That guy rose from the dead, and one day you will be standing in front of that man. And that's kind of fun to play around with. Instead of Jesus, the philosophical concept, it's Jesus, the construction worker turned teacher, and you're going to have to talk with him. So he talks in here about following Jesus. The disciple is thrown out of the relative security of life into complete insecurity, which is in truth absolute security and protection in community with Jesus. So I feel like I'm in charge and I'm supposed to give that up. But the truth of the matter is I don't have the wherewithal to actually be in control of my life. I can't control any of it. I kind of manage the disaster to keep it from sinking me long enough to get to my 67th birthday. But I'm not really in charge. And when the stuff hits the fan, factors way beyond my control are impacting me, and yet I persist in thinking that I'm in charge. It's like a guy that doesn't like flying, and so he doesn't really put his whole weight into the seat during the flight. It's like not working. You're thrown out of the foreseeable and calculable realm, which is in truth unreliable, into the completely unforeseeable, coincidental realm, which in truth is the only necessary and reliable one, out of the realm of limited possibilities, which in truth is that of unlimited possibilities, into the realm of unlimited possibilities, which is in truth the only liberating reality. So it's like everything that we want to think about, I'm a competent adult, is not true. It's an illusion, it's a lie, it's a story we spin to make ourselves feel good about ourselves. And the truth of the matter is, the only person, personality, entity that exists is Jesus, and you are more safe with him in charge than any other thing that you can think of or name. So, and it's kind of a flip for us. Yet there is not a general law. It is either, it is rather the exact opposite of all legalism. Jesus is the only content. So the call to discipleship is a commitment solely to the person of Jesus Christ, a breaking through of all legalism by the grace of him who calls us. Discipleship is commitment to Christ. That's pretty strong.
Yeah.
It's pretty unequivocal. Discipleship, like being part of the church without being really sold out to the person of Jesus, is choosing one's own path. And there's no promise with it. As the chapter rolls on, is where it gets to the other people. He's quoting from Luke 9:57. They went on to another village, and as they were going along the road, someone said to him, I will follow you wherever you go. So this is kind of like, I'm going to call you Lord, but I'm going to be in charge. And Jesus said to him, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man, which is the way he referred to himself, has nowhere to lay his head. So you have this, you're thinking you're choosing something and you want certainty and all that other kind of stuff, and there is none.
Yeah.
To another he said, follow me, but he said, Lord, first let me go bury my father. This is the famous one. But Jesus said to him, let the dead bury their own dead, but as for you, go and proclaim the kingdom of God. And that seems pretty harsh. It's like, what happened to honor your father and mother?
Mhm.
One guy said, well, what if his dad was healthy? And he's like, I'll get to it after I've been, through everything else on my plan. If his dad is literally, at the funeral home and the service is in an hour, that's very different than I'm going to stay here until my dad dies and then I'll take care of all the affairs. And in the meantime, he's fine.
Yeah.
So it's like, who's he talking to here? But just thought of this, proclaim the kingdom of God, that's the Great Commission again, to a particular would-be disciple. It seems to be a drumbeat, like Jesus keeps going back to that, bear witness to the kingdom of God. Boom, boom, boom. The demoniac came out of the graveyard up on the Sea of Galilee, and they cast out legion and went into the herd of pigs, and they drowned. The guy wanted to follow Jesus, and Jesus sent him back to where he was from to tell everybody what God has done for them.
Mhm.
That bearing witness over and over again. That's why we're here. Third one, another one said, I will follow you, Lord, but let me first say farewell to those at my home. And Jesus said to him, no one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God.
This is where this one got me. Is it the fact of the plow going straight ahead to look back as where he has been or where he should be heading? Or
Well, when you plow, you're
always looking
you have
ahead.
a marker on the horizon,
Right.
and you're trying to keep your
and
nose
keep
straight.
focused on that point.
Yeah, and if you can't, you're looking around, you're distracted, you're not interested in your primary purpose.
Yeah, that was the one that didn't make, like, is he saying, was he initially saying that because you have worked in this and what you are now part of this, you don't want to let it go, or what happened?
Yeah, like if you're in, you're in.
You're in.
And there's no, I think it probably fits our normal view of human nature to think that there's a transitional period from one to the other. But so Bonhoeffer takes those three stories and he said, okay, the first disciple took the initiative to follow Jesus. He was not called, and Jesus' answer shows the enthusiastic man that he doesn't know what he's talking about. When Jesus himself calls, however, he overcomes the widest gap. The second disciple wants to bury his father before he follows Jesus. The law obliges him. He knows that he wants to do what he wants to do and has to do. First he has to fulfill the law, then he'll follow. Here, a clear command of the law stands between the one called and Jesus. Jesus' call forcefully challenges this gap. Under no circumstance is anything permitted to come between Jesus and the one called, even that which is greatest and holiest, even the law. So he's telling you who he thinks he is by, I'm more important. It's like, well, it's wake up, tiger. This is who you think it is. The third one called, like the first, understands discipleship as an offer made only by him as his own self-chosen program for life. But in contrast to the first, he thinks he's justified in setting his own conditions to be a disciple of Jesus. Like the American thing, I'll let you be Lord Jesus on these terms.
If, yeah.
That's so cute. Discipleship does not tolerate any condition that could come between Jesus and obedience. Hence, this third one gets caught in a contradiction not only with Jesus but with himself. He does not want what Jesus wants. He likewise does not want what he thinks he wants. He judges himself. He causes his own downfall, all by his request, let me first. Jesus' answer graphically attests to this person's inner conflict, which rules out discipleship. Following Christ means taking certain steps. The first step, which responds to the call, separates the follower from their previous existence. The call to discipleship thus immediately creates a new situation. And that's where we get into I think the main part of the chapter. Here's the quote I was looking for. Only the believer obeys, and only the obedient believe. So when Jesus says, Teresa, come, you get up, you walk away, and go wherever he's
Just
going.
forward, yep.
And the very, however that works in the human brain to like stand up and start walking, that's all the processing time that you have, and the decision precedes the physical movement. But the physical movement is happening instantaneously with the decision, and it's go with Jesus.
Yeah.
So how do we be obedient? I mean, we're sitting here in Burr's edifice, talking about God. He tells another story about Nicodemus, the John 3:16 story, where the rich young ruler comes to Jesus at night, nobody can see, and has these questions. And I think the Synoptics tells it one way as a rich young ruler. John tells it as Nicodemus. And I can't remember who, but it was a sermon, and some guy says, I think it's the same story in all four of the Gospels. And I was thinking, okay, the reason that I think Nicodemus is an old man is because I saw a movie with Sir Laurence Olivier as Nicodemus, and therefore it has to be true. And then when I thought about it, the world is full of older guys dying and leaving their position and their money to their kid. So why can't he be a rich young ruler? And it's a frustrating story if it just has the guy walking away. It's a much more interesting story if it turns out it is Nicodemus, and Nicodemus is the guy that when everybody else is terrified of the state murder mechanism of Pilate, Nicodemus goes for the body and buries him in his own grave and does the funeral ritual for someone that's not his relative. That's a classic, highly regarded act of righteousness within the Jewish worldview to do that. And Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus were both members of the ruling council of 70. Anyway, this rich young man says, what do I have to do? Good teacher, what good deed must I do to have eternal life? And Jesus says, do what you know how to do. And he starts running through the really ethical Ten Commandments. It's like, he starts out saying, why do you call me good in one of them? And why are you asking me about good? There's only one who is good. So now that we've clarified who you're talking to, keep the commandments.
Yep.
Which one? There's 613. You got to keep them all. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. Honor your father and mother. Love your neighbor as yourself, which is Leviticus. It's not the Ten Commandments. The young man said, I have kept all of these. Another Saul of Tarsus kind of guy. What do I still lack? And he says, if you wish to be perfect, Sell your possessions, give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. Once again, it's Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. So it's not ethics. It's not me deciding how much or how little I'm going to do. It's Jesus commanding.
It said here, moral difficulties were the first consequence of the fall, and are they themselves the outcome, quote in parentheses, man in revolt against God. And this is where the young guy, he was trying to work his way around all this, and if I read it up here, he said, once more the young man tries to evade the issue by posing the second question, which he says, well, which of the commands? Because he thought that he had fulfilled everything, and he was perfect, and he was not, and I probably messed this up here, but it was like he was trying to get at something, and Jesus already knew where he was heading with this before he even started the story.
And that's a very characteristic thing of conversations with Jesus is while you're running your mouth, he's already gotten to where you're really coming from, which is very disconcerting.
Yes.
So, hint, save your breath, don't lie to him. He already knows the truth.
Could you imagine the conference if you did cut out all the ridiculous, and you would be sitting here and you would just like, he would nod like, I got you, you're wrong, you're right, have a nice day, thank you for talking with me. And
I had a drill instructor one time named Sergeant Cummings, and he told us right off the bat, he said, there's only 3 things that Army regulations allow you to say to me. Yes, Sergeant, no, Sergeant, no excuse, Sergeant. And he said, I'm going to phrase things for you so that the only thing that you have to remember and the only thing I ever want to hear out of you is, yes, Sergeant. He was the scariest man, little short black guy with the big hat. It will scare the crap out of you. You will remember them for years.
still do to this day.
The chapter ends with question, what should I do? Was the first betrayal. The answer is, do the commandment you know. You should not ask, you should act. The question, who's my neighbor, which is what he went to that story, is the final question of despair or hubris, which is disobedience justifying itself. The answer is you yourself are the neighbor. Go be obedient in acts of love. Being a neighbor is not a qualification of someone else. It is their claim on me and nothing else. At every moment, in every situation, I am the one required to act, to be obedient. There is literally no time left to ask about someone else's qualifications. I'm reminded of, hey, how are you? Peter talking with Jesus, and he says, feed my sheep, feed my sheep, feed my sheep. And then he says, well, what about him? And Jesus said, don't worry about him. Worry about yourself. There is literally no time left to ask about someone else's qualifications. I must act. I must obey. I must be the neighbor to the other person. So the call of Jesus Christ is follow me and no one else.
Pretty straightforward.
Yeah. We're doing a book study on Bonhoeffer's Discipleship, and we just finished chapter 2. We watched a movie about his life, and then we're going to read 3 chapters in Discipleship, and then the other companion book of Life Together. He published them from the same experience. He had that kind of clandestine preacher seminary before World War II really got going, and you had, I think, 30 students at a time for 6 months at a shot. And discipleship is content of the lectures and the coursework, and life together is reflection on how they lived as a community. So we're kind of looking at that, seeing if there's anything that speaks to us about how we ought to be living and acting and so forth. So,
Chapter 3 then.
yep, chapter 3 in discipleship. And I've called it cost of discipleship all my life.
Yeah.
Now I'm trying to change.